In America, we rewrite history by erasing it, as Lillian does that exact thing in this episode. As we get this somewhat Shakespearean, character-driven stage play experience, an experience that I was definitely mixed on. We'll be discussing that and much more in today's spoiler breakdown of episode 7 of The Changeling. But first, make sure to share your thoughts on the episode, as well as the production, the way the story unfolded, the performances, as well as the deeper meanings you all took away, and of course, share your theories, your predictions of what you all hope to see in next week's finale. We got an episode to break down, full spoilers ahead. Now, before we get into this breakdown, I think it's important to call out the perspective and viewpoint of Lillian in this episode. To me, 99% of this episode were her experiences that she had on a particular day that would create her rewriting her story, and this occurs at the very beginning of this episode all the way into the end. This was an allegory of her character's history with heritage, her idea of an American dream, her raising a fatherless son, her relationship with Brian, just to name a few. Also important to note that we see characters we've met play different roles of people she encountered on this night at the hotel, as this was structured like a play. So with that being said, let's open up the curtains and let's begin this journey. As Lillian has been trying to reach her son for 3 days as she walks the streets of New York, she pays a visit to Elk Hotel that has been in business for over 100 years. Built to serve immigrants passing through Ellis Island, as she's here to unmake a deal in what's considered to be the worst hotel in the world. You'll notice that her skin and her face changes with bruising appearing as she's revisiting this past. You'll also see that the man checking her in went by the name of Lester, who was also the same character that played her boss at the law firm. She's checking in alone. Now I believe we saw Charles as Lester because of the reveal that happens later in this episode, as he plays a very key player in her story. Now, the gold dress that appears later is mentioned in this very scene with Lester, as it was worn by a trans woman who was strangled and her body wasn't found for 2 weeks, as she was wearing the same dress that we'll see Lillian in a little bit later. As she sees a younger version of herself dripping in water as she passes a person who's sick, played by Brian, as she enters the room 205. It's this line right here.
Cast our dreams as a play, fills each role, so we may bring the unconscious to consciousness.
Plays each role.
And why?
That informed me that a lot of this was in her mind. And I can relate to this because we can all think of times when we've had dreams and we kind of cast people that we know as characters within these dreams, and we're seeing that happen right now. Quick flashback to 1981, where Lillian found the smoke coming underneath her door, where Brian was with Apollo, a day that changed her. Now we see William plays a role of this man outside of the door trying to get the attention of Angela, who appeared to be a lady of the night, as I believe William was cast in this role because he's an attacker, he's the aggressor in this story. As Lillian's early life story begins, we learn that Lillian has held 3 dying men in her lifetime, and right now I'm counting her cousin. Later we find out about the sick man, and with the third person be Brian, as we take a journey through her immigrant story and how she felt responsible for the things that happened to Uganda after she left. It seems that the terrible and horrible things seem to always find Lillian as she begins questioning her belief system in God. Now this was a quick moment, but the hand reaching out to her in a mirror, is that the same creature at the end of this very episode? Is that the creature that was spoken back in the beginning of episode 3 that grew legs and made his way to the land? We'll be breaking that down a little bit later, but now while I felt the placement of this episode was in question, I can't deny the incredible detail and great production value taking place in this one location. It was just outstanding to me as we see her story being displayed on the walls like a projection. As we explore her hope that everything would be different when she arrived to America, she had hopes and dreams. Things started off good for her in New York. She met a guy, she fell in love, she had a kid. Promised Land had lived up to her dreams, but she realized that she had to get smaller in order for those dreams to come true. As we notice more roles being played out in this dream, the character Kim is playing a mother, and the father of that mother is actually her dad, which makes me think, and this is just a side note, I don't know if we'll have more time to explore Emma's parents and how important they are to the story, because obviously we spent more time with Apollo's parents, but I'm very curious if we'll ever get the backstory of why Emma and Kim's mother decided to burn down their house. As Lillian recalls her upbringing and records her experiences when she was growing up and why she didn't raise Apollo the same way. Now this is where we transition over to her exploring her love and her fears of being a wife, but also motherhood. See the red suitcase being given to her. It's kind of a representation of her hopes and dreams in the form of what's inside that suitcase. We see the gold dress. We can recall her talking about her family would say that maybe one day she could find herself singing in a saloon, which obviously speaks into a scene that we'll get into here in a second. We find out that Lillian had to get rid of those dreams because she had her son, and she gave all her dreams and hopes to Apollo. So not only do we learn that Lillian had to put her dreams aside to be the mother she wanted to be for Apollo, but she also fell in love with Brian. This is where we learn that Brian's wounds were set by his mom, who hated him deeply. He felt betrayed by her and could never get past that. He had parents who didn't love him, and Lillian knew this was a red flag, but she ignored it. We see Brian's accomplishments as he boxed them away to kind of show he lived a life, but Brian fell in love with a woman who didn't love him. But why did he choose Lillian? Why was she special? That's the question I have in my mind. Did he see something in her like the Norwegian men saw in Emma, or was it because she was alone and didn't have a family, and this was a perfect match for him to kind of create his own dream family that he never had? Now, this is a very important line I want you all to remember. Lillian says that she got with Brian to cover up a mistake. Again, we'll talk about that later as we see that they had a very dysfunctional relationship when they were together. Lillian puts on a dress as the lights of the hotel go off. She's prepared to attend someone's son who's in pain. As Brian plays the role of the sick stranger who appeared to have HIV, but I can't seem to figure out why was Brian playing this role. Was it because of the poor relationship with their mother, or as the theme and the key line that was said a few times in this episode, he didn't think he existed? Maybe that's the connection that she had with people that she came across at this motel. They all shared that same fear of being alone, but also feeling that they don't exist. Let me know your connections on this scene and why it was important for Brian to play that role. Discuss how hard it's been for him and that he can't sleep. He also really misses his mom, and he knows he's gonna die, as Lillian knows the same will happen to her a little bit later. He tells her the story of him and Bill, who was a married man with kids, as they plan a trip to see Lena Horne at a concert and them having a secret relationship. I believe the show is using the name Bill in this particular story because I think it's referring to Billy Strayhorn, who was a very famous and influential jazz pianist and composer, and openly gay, but also he had a huge influence on the career of Lena Horne, who wanted to marry Bill and considered him to be the love of her life. So I think there's some connections there with Lena and Bill. Let me know if you guys were thinking the same. Now, after he got sick, Bill left him and never returned. He couldn't go back to his home to see his mom because he didn't want his mom to see him like this. Dying wish was to see Lena performing in Stormy Weather, as Lillian gives him this wish and she performs. Now, while I felt this was a personal and beautiful story, I don't know the meaning or the significance of this interaction. Why was it important to her story? Was it that she was able to sing for him before he died, connecting that to her dream of singing? Was it because he died alone and his mom not being there and knowing where his whereabouts was, so she kind of has that motherly instinct to be there for someone and being there for someone's son? Also, does that connect to the 3 dying men in her arms? Again, knowing that her cousin died in her arms, now this gentleman dies in her arm. Let me know what you all think the deeper meaning of this particular interaction was in the comments below. As she sees William's character attacking the woman and Lester saving her, but before he scared the gentleman off, he tells him,
"You again. You're gonna find yourself stuffed in a suitcase at the bottom of a river."
And we see Angela say that she doesn't exist. Now, was this Lillian's character recalling this situation of this attack being another example of her fear of dying alone? And was this some type of connection to when she found Brian attacking Apollo a little bit later? And does that give her the idea to put Brian's body in that suitcase in the bottom of the water, as Lester said in this very scene? This leads to Lillian worrying about who's going to teach Apollo these things that are said to be taught by men. Similar to the idea of mothers passing down advice from generation to generation, who will teach him to be a man, to be a father, as we learn how Brian didn't want to leave Apollo, but he wanted Apollo too much. Cut to a scene with Brian and Lillian at a picnic, and he passively aggressively kind of threatens her by saying that he's going to put her in asylum if he wanted to, and there would be no one to ever find her because all of her family's no longer here and no one would know that she's missing. But also he tells her that she doesn't exist, which we know is a very important theme of this episode, as Lillian knew this was a red flag, and she took that threat as a way of shutting off a door inside of her for the love that she had or used to have for Brian, and she began living in fear as the storm is coming. We learn the origins of the Elk Hotel receipt being found in Brian's box. This is such a key component to her story because we'll be breaking it down at the end here, but I personally believe this was the reason that Lillian got with Brian to cover up a mistake she had with a married man. Now, Brian convinces himself that Lillian was having an affair with her boss at the firm, Charles Blackwood, and in my personal opinion, I think that his insecurities were amplified because as we learn in this episode, he lost his trust in his own mother, and I think he carried that distrust into this relationship. And the fears of Lillian leaving him one day was definitely kind of something that always stood on the top of his mind. As they just continued to fight and inevitably they split up, she was frightened that one day that he would take her baby. That's right, not their baby, but her baby. I want you guys to remember that. As Brian says that Lillian is just like his mother, he used a key word here. He tells her that she's a glamour. Was Lillian just appearing one way but different in reality? Or as Brian would say it, was Lillian a shark? As she arrives to her front door and opens up to see one of the most horrific things that I would imagine any parent can imagine seeing, and that is Brian drowning their son Apollo in boiling hot water, which is such a terrifying thing to see. But I want to point out a couple things in this moment. Now, Brian seemed to be very violent at the tail end of their relationship, but the question that I can't shake, that boiling water. We know Emma used the hot boiling water to get rid of the Changeling baby. Brian doing the same thing to 4-year-old Apollo. Did he do that because he thought Apollo was a changeling, or did he want to just kill the most important person in her life? But also, one thing the show hasn't addressed quite yet is, what is the significance of both parents trying to kill their children? We obviously know Emma's mom tried to do that. Now, Brian, I really hope that they explain this by the finale next week. Even though Brian was the American cop and what she did would get her burnt alive like the witches before, she had no choice but to kill him. As young Lillian was prepared to take her own life until the older version stopped her for doing so, or as the younger version Lillian says, she believed that this was Lady God. This is the beginnings of her rewriting her story as she rediscovers God and asking for help from the spirits. Should she be punished for lying to her husband and son, or this action of wanting to take her own life as she's ready to make a deal? Now, the deal would include her being the best mother possible for Apollo as long as she can get rid of this thing. Was this thing getting rid of Brian's body, or was that thing getting rid of the changeling that Brian had found in Apollo? But more importantly, who exactly was she making a deal with? Is this some type of dark magic, or is it similar to the deal that Emma made in Brazil with that witch? Either way, this deal would get paid in full 35 years later by her son Apollo, as the gods will take what they are owed. As Lillian eventually comes up with a way of getting rid of her problem, all her secrets and dreams and hopes in this red suitcase, this is her way of rewriting her story. As there is nothing she wouldn't do to protect her loved ones, and she remembers the promise she made to always protect Apollo, a promise that she would always keep. And if you're looking for a sign, this is it. Lillian felt like an American. We end the episode with us going back into that hotel in present day, and we see the check-in book showing that Lillian and Charles did share a room together, and in 1977, Apollo was born. We see the younger Lillian at the same pier we saw her at the beginning of episode 3 as she throws her history and story in the water, but history will not stay buried. Deals can't be unmade, and gods will take their pay as this creature from the water reaches out for that suitcase. Let's talk about the ending of this episode. Was it just implied that Charles may be Apollo's real father? Brian right the whole time? Was she having an affair? Is Lillian a glamour giving off an illusion? Think about episode 1. We saw Charles giving her all those books for Apollo to read. I'm thinking to myself when that happened, oh, this is just his way to try to get her attention. Like, hey, I'm showing interest in your kid. Can you give me some play? But maybe it was a married man trying to secretly give gifts to his son. Even in 1988, Lillian would still pay visits to that hotel. This being that secret, there were so many times in this episode that they mentioned there was a mistake made by her and her getting with Brian, and this being a cover-up. She wasn't publicly in a relationship with anyone, so where would a baby come from? But then comes the man Brian, who's been chasing her for years, and now it's time for him to be the father of her child that was made by a married man. Let me know if you all think that Charles is Apollo's real father. Getting back to the creature that we saw in the mirror, as well as at the end of this episode. Now, I believe this ties to the story being told in the narration of the beginning of episode 3 of a mythical creature coming from the sea and walking on earth. That creature at the end, is that Brian in his true form? Is he the same as William? Is he a fairy? Are they the ones that are eating the children? We don't know what Lillian did with Brian's body. Was he in that suitcase and is now resurrected in his true form, which is in that fairy creature body? So curious to see if that secret of Lillian will eventually come to light, because if Brian is dead, who brought the box to their front door when Apollo was a teenager? So many interesting questions to be hopefully answered in next week's finale. But to give you all my general opinion and my review of this particular episode, I'm going to be 100% honest with you all. On my first viewing, I did not like this episode at all. Mostly because it felt unnecessary, but also it felt like they were talking in riddles the whole time and the placement of the episode just felt off. But after a couple rewatches, I came to appreciate the story being told, but also the nuanced performance by Adina Porter and all the little details mentioned in this video. I really came to appreciate the storytelling, the filmmaking, and the performance of this particular episode. But I'm not gonna lie, I still have my issues with this episode. Number one, the placement of the episode feels off to me. Like, we only have one episode left and this is the second to last episode. I think personally they should have rearranged the order of the episodes, as in my mind it should have went 1 through 3 stays the same. But then when you go further down the episodes, I believe episode 6 should have been in place in episode 4. Episode 7 should have been in place of episode 5. And then we have episodes 4 and 5, which were Apollo focused stories, those being episodes 6 and 7, because those are the episodes that move the story forward, not backwards. And yes, I get the whole thing of tell me your story and I'll tell you who you are type of narrative, but I think it just would have played better narratively for me to seeing the story moving forward, like I said, instead of going backwards and seeing flashbacks of people's imaginations and dreams, and obviously getting that Alice in Wonderland focused episode with Emma. But we haven't seen Apollo's story in 2 weeks, and my fear is when it comes to next week's finale, I feel like it's going to be rushed and we won't have enough time to answer all the questions that remain. My last criticism, this is kind of more of a nitpick. The accent that the older version of Lillian has, to me, is kind of very distracting, especially when you put the same characters in the same room. But again, that's a very little minute kind of nitpick that I had. But overall, after rewatching this episode, I like what this had to say about an immigrant story, about Lillian's fears of a relationship, about motherhood, and her being alone and being a nobody and not existing, but her taking control of her narrative, her taking control of her story, but ultimately knowing that there will be consequences to her actions. Again, overall, a pretty solid episode in my humble opinion. So I hope you all enjoyed today's breakdown and my thoughts and theories and predictions of episode 7 of The Changeling. I'm gonna need y'all to let me know what you thought of everything I said in today's video, but more importantly, let me know your thoughts, your opinions. What did you take away from the episode? What were your interpretations of certain scenes? But also share your theories and your predictions of what you all hope to see in next week's finale. And if you could please like today's video, consider sharing, but also consider subscribing to the channel, helping me reach my next milestone of 60,000 subscribers. I would greatly appreciate it. Now, if you guys are looking for more videos from me, check out my coverage that I did for Fantastic Fest of 2023 this year, as well as if this is your first time watching one of my breakdowns, click the playlist here so you can see all my breakdowns of The Changeling. You all are awesome. Hope you're staying safe, and I'll catch you all on the next video.